Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Flichikowski and today I'll be discussing the Lake Nipissing Pickerel dispute for our Law 202 case study assignment. To begin, I'll introduce the issue that I've chosen. The pickerel, also known as walleye here in Canada, is the most predominant fish species caught nationally. Many scientists have recently concluded that this population of fish is rapidly declining in Lake Nipissing in northeastern Ontario. These fish are edible and profitable and are harvested by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians surrounding the waters. The conflict lies in the understanding and management of the dwindling pickerel population between these two groups. Indigenous peoples are thought to have inhabited the region continuously for almost 10,000 years before first contact with European colonists. In the Algonquin language, the peoples were called Nipissing, meaning big water. The Nipissing, like most of the other tribes in the region, were primarily hunter-gatherers. The Nipissing had a reputation among other tribes for the spiritual power of their shamans. However, this reputation did not deter French settlers from visiting the area in 1615. Due to its strategic location between Lake Huron and the Ottawa Valley, trade routes around Lake Nipissing quickly became popular with a full invasion of non-Aboriginal hunters occurring during the 19th century. A treaty specifically affecting the Nipissing, entitled the Robinson-Huron Treaty, or Crown Treaty 61, was implemented in 1850. The treaty was signed to preserve their way of life and command the northern shores of Lake Nipissing and its main waterways. However, it essentially was a sale of land to the Crown in exchange for a small quantity of money to be distributed between the bands as a one-time payment. I'd like to note that this slide does not do justice to the rich and vast history of the region and its peoples. However, for the purposes of this presentation, I've chosen just a handful of facts. Fast forward to today, the Nipissing First Nation Reserve Number 10 consists of historic First Nation band governments of Ojibwe and Algonquin descent. The 21,000 hectares of land supports a population of over 2,500 individuals. It is equipped with a tribal council and governed by a custom electoral system. In January of 2014, the Nipissing adopted what is believed to be the first constitution for First Nation in Ontario. It was designed to replace the Indian Act, but has not yet been tested out in the courts. Bringing it back to the issue at hand, I'd like to outline several legal doctrines that apply to the Indigenous population of Lake Nipissing. Most broadly, Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the protection of Aboriginal rights, including treaty rights constructed throughout Canada's history. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples reaffirms Indigenous rights, but more specifically describes the inherent right to traditionally owned and occupied land and resources. In addition, it outlines that states shall give legal recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources conducted with due respect to the customs and traditions of the Indigenous peoples concerned. Specific to fishing rights, the Canadian Constitution states that those with the appropriate status may fish for food without a license or restrictions. Recent decisions by the Supreme Court of Canada on Aboriginal fishing rights have been the focus of much media attention. Those advocating the recognition of an Aboriginal right in the commercial fishery and those opposed to such an initiative have both claimed victory in recent landmark rulings. Despite the legislation in place, the Supreme Court has essentially left the issue open for further debate. In Lake Nipissing, many do not believe or refuse to acknowledge the issue. Both Indigenous and non-Indigenous scientists suggest, however, that a dwindling pickerel population exists and can be attributed to overfishing, harsh netting practices, and habitat destruction. Indigenous and non-Indigenous anglers accuse the other of harming the population as both groups fish commercially and privately on the Lake Nipissing. Indigenous peoples argue that it is their right to fish and that they have sustainably harvested the fish for thousands of years. Some non-Indigenous anglers believe that Indigenous fishing rights are exploiting and damaging the fish population. The issue has countless negative effects, including a loss of food source, livelihood, tourism, biodiversity, as well as a continuation of the strain on the relationship between the Nipissing First Nation and non-Indigenous community. The issue has a range of potential solutions. Least invasively, introducing fish farming, promoting alternative fishing practices, and closely monitoring anglers on the water to enforce fishing restrictions. Most invasively, stricter fish limits could be imposed or treaty rights to fish could be limited. In recognition of the Nipissing First Nations self-government, the Ministry of Natural Resources has worked alongside the Indigenous government to formulate conservation strategies. The First Nation took a proactive approach, compromising by accepting a year-long moratorium on fishing to allow the fish population to rebound and regrow. The Ministry of Natural Resources and Nipissing First Nation have agreed to share their data and resources about harvest and fish stocks, share resources and costs for fishing assessments, provide training on fisheries management, and provide direct assistance with enforcement of Nipissing First Nation fishing laws. This issue, like many facing Indigenous Canadians, is rooted inexplicitly in colonialism. The Nipissing lived alongside other bands for thousands of years while operating a self-sustaining community. Upon first contact, geographic area was lost and eventually Indigenous self-government began to disappear. Government and land management practices were imposed on the Nipissing without their consideration, and this significantly impacted their traditional way of life. The Indigenous peoples experienced subordination, trickery, and ultimately oppression that still exists today. Some of the distrust in the Canadian government arises from the past abuses suffered by the Indigenous peoples as a result of federal government action or inaction. Members of the Nipissing First Nation describe feelings of racial tension, although on the surface the issue appears to be about who gets the fish. For those whose lives may have been scarred by residential schools, they may still be grieving and bitter, especially considering the lack of empathy felt by the majority of the non-Indigenous population of Canada. Lake Nipissing is described by their chief as the lifebed of our people. Historically, the Nipissing First Nation depended on the fishery for trade and self-sustainability. Today, the fishery continues to be an important part of the community. Although the economy is no longer dependent on the fishery, there are several harvesters that depend on this for a livelihood. However, a vast majority of the community still depend on the Lake Nipissing fishery stocks for sustenance, and this is something that has been taken away by colonialism in the past, and due to mismanagement, is threatening the food source yet again. And now for the bottom line. If a crisis exists, who is responsible? Perhaps instead of pointing fingers, every user of the water can reflect on their own behavior and collectively anglers can work together to protect the pickerel. Perhaps fishing rights should be restricted. However, power must be given to the protected Indigenous fishing rights and autonomy must be given to the Indigenous governments to formulate species conservation strategies that respect their culture and traditions. Where does the Canadian government fit in? They have resources including extensive scientific equipment, law enforcement personnel, and funding for sustainability initiatives that would benefit the pickerel. They do not, however, have the sole authority over the fish and should not work independently in finding a solution. Collaboration with the Nipissing First Nation is the way to promote reconciliation. Why I chose this topic? I'm a science student passionate about fish and immediately felt compelled to research this issue. What have I learned? Indigenous peoples are constantly fighting to defend and justify their inherent rights. They are forced to share their resources with others, but often take the opportunity to teach their way of life and peacefully compromise where necessary. I hope I was able to spark your curiosity and emphasize the complexity of the issue. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to watching your case study presentations.